Hi, I'm Coltin. Did you know that Brigham Young, the second prophet of the LDS Church, had a son who was a cross-dresser, or as we modernly know it as performed in drag? I never knew this, and when I found this out while researching for this project, it fascinated me. Brigham Morris Young was one of the children of Brigham Young. He, not much is known from his childhood, and we know that he served a mission for the church. Upon returning home from that mission, he got married to a woman and had multiple kids. They ended up going on another mission for the church, and upon returning, that was when the history we're talking about really starts. He, upon returning, decided to start performing while cross-dressing under the pseudonym Madame Petrini, an Italian opera star. This blew my mind. I had never heard this before, and it's really cool to see. His son, Brigham Morris Young's son, stated that he had a very high falsetto voice, and when he sang, it truly did sound like a woman singing. He also has stated that there were many people, when coming to his performances, at times, some of them could not tell who he was and actually believed he was a woman. They would have never guessed that he was Brigham Morris Young. And while there is no direct evidence that Brigham Morris Young was for sure part of the LGBTQ community, because of the history being quite far back, there are many rumors along with the cross-dressing that kind of show a little bit to potentially that he was part of the community in that sense. One of these rumors was that as a day job he decided to be a streetcar driver. And a common stereotype around that time period was that streetcar drivers were stereotypically effeminate homosexuals. It's very well known that the famous author Walt Whitman would go to streetcar drivers to find many of his male partners, including his most famous partner, Peter Doyle, who he writes about in a lot of his different writings. Another interesting rumor is that Brigham Morris Young drove a streetcar between the Utah Central Railroad and the Wasatch Municipal Baths. What's interesting about this is that this was commonly a path that many would take that were homosexual men if they were looking for some anonymous sexual encounters. Now, these don't necessarily specifically state that Brigham Morris Young was part of the LGBTQ community, but it's very fascinating to know that he definitely could be, and really brought forth a new perspective during that time period in the late 1800s in the LDS Church. Because of this interesting fact, I decided to talk to my dad and stepdad, who are both members of the church, and ask them a little bit about their perspective on Brigham Morris Young and how this history and impacts them and why LGBTQ history is so important to them. This is my dad, Jaron, and my stepdad, Graham. Thank you for agreeing to have this interview with me.
Of course.
So first question that I want to ask is, what was your experiences like growing up as part of the LGBTQ community in the church?
Say I can kind of sum it up in one word, and that's lonely. I think when you grow up in the LDS church, in the past especially, it just was not very talked about. And if you did talk about it, it was, there was a lot of shame-based learning in that. So you kind of end up growing up thinking you're the only person that is dealing with it at all.
I think I would add to that, agree with that, and then add guilty. There was a lot of guilt for being told how wrong it is and knowing it's who you are, but not able to express it and talk about it.
No.
Yeah. And knowing this knowledge of Brigham Morris Young and the history with him in the church, why is it so important to have the history of the LGBTQ community, especially today?
Well, I think for those youth that grow up thinking that they're alone and don't know that there is some guy in England, thousands of miles away who is, dealing with the same thing or the same internal struggles or these same feelings of being gay, knowing that there are other people in history that are actually part of your religion and part of your community, not just people in New York and in California and on TV who are gay. We want to know that there's people like us, and you want to identify with people that are like you and you relate better. And if the only thing you have to relate to are people who are straight Mormons, you just don't really have the same relationship. And so you do end up thinking, like I said, you're the only one. But if you could grow up knowing that Brigham Young had a cross-dressing son, and it was okay, and it was accepted at the time because he was married and had children or whatever, then maybe that could give a little bit more hope, a little more courage to the youth and people of nowadays.
Yeah, I was going to use the word courage, knowing that 200 years ago, when it was even less accepted than it is now, there were people back then that had the bravery to get out there and do that. So it gives me hope, gives me courage that there's this change available.
Yeah, I think personally, just from talking to you both over the past few years especially, and you always saying how everyone says, oh, it's your choice, you're choosing to do this. And I think it really gives can put a different perspective for those who say that, knowing, there was people potentially back at the very starting times of the church that were dealing, as you say, dealing with the same things, and wanting to express themselves for who they really were and how they love to portray themselves.
Well, there's even people nowadays, we have general authorities, prophets, apostles who have gay children, who have gay grandchildren, gay siblings. Talk about it. Talk about it in your general conferences and whatever. Help them see that it isn't this, because even though they're my grandson, I'm going to put it behind in the shadows and I'm not going to talk about it. Talk about it. You'll relate way better to people if you do.
Yeah, Brigham Morris, I didn't even know existed until within the last year is when I learned about him. So yeah, talk about it. Make it real.
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree. As you told me recently about about his existence, I guess you could say, because I definitely didn't know or have ever heard about it. So thank you for sharing that with me and really opening me up to a new perspective on the LGBTQ community and the church, especially in the early history. So appreciate it. From my experiences researching about Brigham Morris Young and being able to interview my dad and my stepdad, I've really come to see the importance of the history of the LGBTQ community and why it's so needed, and specifically how important it is to have the history of the LGBTQ community in the LDS church. And I'm very grateful for the experiences I've been able to have to learn this for myself.